I'm very glad to be able to welcome today on behalf of British Pugwash, but also on behalf of all of you who've registered for this meeting, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, not least because he is very well qualified to talk to us about the topic of China's approach towards nuclear disarmament. A slight change at his request from the original topic of China's approach to nuclear risk reduction, but not, in my view anyway, a very significant approach. We shall see. He's a former Deputy Director General for Arms Control at China's Ministry of National Defense, and is currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Stability and Security in Beijing. So welcome, Colonel. Thank you very much for finding the time to speak to us today. I am much looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and so I imagine all the others who are on this call. Over to you.
Good evening from Beijing. Thank you, Ambassador Peter Jenkins, for this great opportunity. As you have correctly introduced, I was in charge of arms control, basically for 2.5 years, from 2004 to 2006. For 2.5 years.
Put on my headphones.
Yeah, there was a kind of echo, but now it's gone. Yeah, now it's gone. Yeah. So during that period of time, that was 20 years ago, I have heard of Pugwash, but since I mostly work on track 1 level, so I didn't have much interaction with you. So this is indeed a great honor for me to be able to talk to Pugwash members 20 years later. And I'm especially grateful that my Master of St. Edmund, Sir Brian Hipp, is actually present, because particularly because he actually is suffering from COVID. So I'm truly, truly grateful to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. Now, I'm going to talk today on a few aspects that are nuclear related and also China related. So the first question is, are we already in another nuclear age? Let me quote what our late Premier Chauvenay said when he was asked by the French journalist, what do you think of a French Revolution? And his answer later became world famous. He said, it's too early to tell. Then my answer for this question, well, whether we have entered into a new Cold War or not, again, is probably it's too early to tell, particularly because it is something down the road in the future. But if we would have nuclear weapon states like the United States to kick off nuclear tests, as suggested by a number of Americans, including former American, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, who just encouraged Trump, should he become elected, to conduct a nuclear test. If we, again, have a nuclear test started by the United States, I'm very much sure it will be followed by others. First by Russia, and then perhaps China. Then we definitely can say the big bang of nuclear test indicate the dawning of the new Cold War. So let me first talk about the possibility of nuclear war in Europe and China's position. According to Americans' poll, I think the chance of a nuclear war in Ukraine is 50%, to 50%. So don't know exactly what might happen. But according to CSIS, there are over 200 cases of Russian leadership referring to use of nuclear weapon in the context of the war in Ukraine. The question is, how serious are Russians? What we are seeing is that a few days ago, President Putin has ordered change of nuclear doctrine. Basically, that means lowering of the threshold. And nuclear weapons might be used in response to an attack on Russia and Belarus using conventional weapons if the attack poses a crucial threat to sovereignty. This kind of description of a crucial threat to sovereignty actually is ambiguous, because then comes the questions: what are just the crucial threats? If this is not alarming enough, what really alarms me as a scholar is that some prominent Russian scholars have actually joined the choir. For example, Sergei Karaganov and Dmitry Chenin. You all know about the so-called Karaganov debate. He said so many things. Yeah, he has alarmed so many people with his remarks on how Russia would have to, drop a nuclear bomb. And he talked about nuclear escalation may open Pandora's box, but it will also free the world from the 500-year-long Western yoke. I'm sure he's right. If Russia opens the Pandora's box, it will free the world from the 500-year-long Western yoke. But it will also free the world from human beings. And that's the problem, right? And Dmitry Chenin urges the Russian leadership to put a nuclear bullet into the so-called revolver drum. So all these remarks together really send alarming signals. But I personally believe there are a few situations in which Russia might be Russia is more likely to use nuclear weapons. One is if they might lose Crimea, which is not quite possible in the current circumstances. And then if they lose the 4 southeastern regions that are already declared to be Russian territory under Russian constitutions. Of course, there is a huge debate as to whether they could have full control over 4 southeastern regions or not. I believe the right answer is nobody knows, including President Putin. I know what he wants. He wants these 4 provinces. He wants Ukraine not to join NATO. But the point is he cannot make sure that he could have full control over the 4 regions. Yeah, because Ukraine, fully supported by the United States and Europe, will continue to fight. Once I had a conversation with a Ukrainian ambassador, somewhere in Ireland, and she said something that really impressed me. I said, how long will the war last? And she said, our grandchildren will continue to fight. I don't know whether that is true or not, but that is what she said. So this is the second possibility, but the last one probably looks most real. That is when red lines no longer look like a red line. I believe that is the time when the situation is most dangerous. I'm referring to, US supported Ukraine in the fighting deeper and deeper in the Russian territory using the weapons provided by the West. Because if that is a red line in the beginning, it no longer looks like a red line. Then let's look at what has happened about NATO's expansion. I have talked to so many people in the West. They don't believe that NATO's expansion is the very reason, that Russia decided to have a conflict with Ukraine. But I believe it is. In fact, warnings from Russia does not only come from President Putin. It came from the Soviet time. It came from Mikhail Gorbachev down to Boris Yeltsin to President Putin. And what makes Putin different? And I believe he's the man who said enough is enough. So how the end game in Ukraine would look like, right now it's too early to tell, but I believe the biggest possibility is a kind of armistice, very much like that in the Korean Peninsula. But this armistice would be more volatile in that one party is one of the P5 countries with the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. But I think I know what Russia is going to do. It will just play with kind of a nuclear ambiguity, or maybe a very thinly veiled nuclear threats in decades to come. Why is that? The reason is very simple, because Russia, the conventional force, has declined tremendously, unlike in 1982, when they actually announced the no first use of nuclear weapons. And in 1993, they dropped this pledge because after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia is no longer as strong as before. Then, what about China? First of all, I need to say something about China's friendship with Russia, which is described as unlimited partnership, which alarms the whole West. But for me, this kind of unlimited partnership is just a natural description of China's good wish to develop its friendship with its largest neighbor. Just think of this. If I say I want to develop my friendship with you, but then I say, but hang on for a moment, this friendship has to be limited. What do you think? Yeah, let me give you another example. When we talk to Pakistanis, Pakistani would say, China-Pakistani friendship is higher than Himalayan mountain, deeper than Arabian Sea, and more sweeter than honey. And what would you do? You would smile, and probably you would nod your head, because you know he means no harm, and that's it. Then the second thing is China is not a decisive enabler of Russia, as NATO described. I tell you why China is not a decisive enabler. I know the West is not happy with China, exporting a lot of things that might be dual use in nature. But when something is dual use in nature, first we have to assume it is a civilian product rather than a military product. Just like oil and gas. Nobody considers oil and gas a military product. But if it is put into the tank of a military truck, it could immediately become a kind of military product. But when it is dual use nature, we have to assume it is for civilian use first. I think China does export more things to Russia, partly because Russia is being sanctioned, and partly because China wants to export more because Chinese economy, is not as good as before. But none of these exports is violating any international treaties. So about Russia using nuclear weapon, I think in China, all people, from ordinary Chinese people to Chinese leadership, the attitude is quite clear. I myself has written an opinion that was published in Financial Times, ending with a sentence: China can help the world by simply telling Putin, don't use nuclear weapons, Mr. President. I know the good relationship between China and Russia, but I also know it is a decades-old, firm Chinese policy of not using nuclear weapons first. So I'm talking about this as ordinary Chinese. But I'm happy to say President Xi also told German Chancellor Olaf Scholz a week after my opinion was published in Financial Times, no use of nuclear weapons in Europe. And Olaf Scholz was so happy because his visit to China actually was criticized by some people. And he went back and he said, even for this consensus, his visit to China was worthwhile. Then I need to say something about P5's joint statement in 2022, before Russia's war in Ukraine. This is an old slogan coming from the Cold War. Nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This is nothing new. But what is most interesting is that when President Xi Jinping visited Russia in March 2023, China, that is amid the war. Again, we have a joint statement, between China and Russia, in which this slogan is repeated. So then we have to wonder what happened, behind the door in the conference room. I think China has been trying, its best, in telling Russia not to use nuclear weapons. Otherwise, how could we have this joint statement during President Xi's visit, right? That is a logic, conclusion. So that means China is really trying hard, to make its due contribution towards peace and stability in Europe. Then we don't know whether Russia will use it or not. And it's not for China to decide. But I think the attitude of China, India, and Brazil matters for Russia. So I believe right now, President Putin probably is the most rational person, in Russian leadership, because he even denied the possibility of using nuclear weapon when he was asked by Sergei Karaganov whether Russia should use it or not. He said no. But at the same time, I believe that to do with these countries, would also matter. And I hope it matters. Yeah. Now, let me talk about China's nuclear modernization. Yeah. Reportedly, China has 500 nuclear warheads, and it has an ambition to increase its nuclear arsenal to 1,500 by 2035, according to Pentagon. No one in China will confirm this number because this is considered a secret in China. But even if this is true, China's nuclear arsenal is still much smaller than that of the United States and Russia. Both of them have more than 5,000 nuclear warheads. Then, as a Chinese, I have to think about this. For China, for us to increase, it should be something very simple, because China has technical know-how. And China is the strongest industrial nation on earth. And China's economy is at least 10 times larger than Russia. Even it was like that 5 to 6 years ago. So what is impeding China from having more nuclear warheads? I believe that is because China believes it should not enter into a nuclear arms race. And China's defense budget tells more than anything about this. Why? Because I believe in international relations, there are two things that won't lie. Geography would not lie, because your operation, your action would be very much constrained by your geography. Such as in Korean Peninsula, people are talking about how DPRK might launch a nuclear attack. But think of Korean Peninsula, which is just 1,200 kilometers for the whole length. So you have to ask, in what kind of situation would he make such a suicidal launch, a nuclear attack, right? So geography would definitely play a huge role in decision making. Then defense budget would not lie, because defense budget, whether you increase it or not increase it, will tell a lot about yourself, about what you think about the environment, about what you think about your adversary or your enemy. So China's defense budget has been on the 2% for decades, for 4 decades. Basically, it's most of the time it's around or lower even than 1.5% of its GDP. This tells a lot about China. It tells China is confident about itself. It tells China is confident about the region, and it even tells China is confident about the China-US relationship. And China's confidence certainly matters. Because if China is not confident, if China drastically increases defense budgets like India, like Japan, then the whole Asia Pacific would be chaotic. Now, next slide. Okay, then let me try to explain what does nuclear capabilities at the minimum level mean. This is quoted in several Chinese defense white paper. So we maintain that we just want to maintain nuclear capability at the minimum level. Then what is the minimum level? My personal understanding is no nuclear weapon states dare to launch preemptive nuclear strike on China, in spite of China's no first use of nuclear weapon. And this requires China to have adequate strength of deterrence. Everybody knows that recently China launched a CBM into the Southern Pacific. So what does this mean? Chinese press release didn't tell much, but of course I believe it is a boost of Chinese people's confidence in its own military. It is also a demonstration of China's military capability, but it also demonstrates that China would have to modernize its armed forces. Yeah, I think modernization, means new capabilities and reasonably increase the quantity. Otherwise, it's like maintenance, right? If you just keep the same number and then you just do maintenance job. So modernization means new capability and reasonably increase the quantity. Now, China's launching has been notified to the United States. The United States has expressed appreciation for this. And this invited me a question. So would one day the United States also notify China about its nuclear activities or about its ICBM launches? Because anyway, China and the United States have actually signed an agreement on mutual notification of major military activities. Then what are major military activities? Of course, China's firing of ICBM is one of them. Then what about the United States? Would you notify China what you're going to do in the South China Sea? Or would you notify China when the ships are going to sail through Taiwan Strait? Yeah. So this is, I believe, would be a question. Yeah. Then it would be perhaps surprising for you to know that I'm going to talk about the possibility of a nuclear war in the Taiwan Strait. Chinese government still talk about peaceful reunification. And even American Secretary of Defense, Lord Austin, said at Shangri-La Dialogue, a war is not imminent or inevitable. I'm so happy that he talked about this because this is a direct denial of quite a few allegations from some American generals, admirals, that China is about to invade Taiwan in 2025, 2027, so on and so forth. Because Austin should have talked with authority based on information, based on intelligence, and so on and so forth. So we don't believe that a war is inevitable or imminent. And we certainly would not use nuclear weapons against our own people in Taiwan. Yeah, this can hardly be imagined for any Chinese. But then the question is, there are some Americans like former Deputy Assistant Secretary Aubrey Jacoby, or some think tanks like Atlantic Council talking about United States using nuclear weapons first in Taiwan Strait because it is becoming more and more inferior to China in terms of conventional warfare. So my answer to this is, we have to let the United States give up this crazy idea. And for that to happen, I think we have to increase, some nuclear weapons. So we could prevail in a conventional war against the United States, in which the United States dare not use nuclear weapons against China. Then there are two misses on China's nuclear policy. One is China doesn't want talks on nuclear disarmament. You should have heard a lot about this. But my argument is it really depends on what you want to talk to China. How about talking about China's proposal? No first use of nuclear weapons. Isn't that a suitable subject? Of course, China is more than willing to talk about this, right? But if you want to talk to China to find out, the purpose, the speed, of China's nuclear modernization or development, probably you would become disappointed, because for that to happen, either China has to drastically increase its nuclear stockpile, or the United States has to drastically decrease its nuclear stockpile. None of them looks possible. The second miss is really something most recent and most ridiculous. In the so-called nuclear employment guidance, it is reported that US has to prepare for coordinated nuclear confrontation with China, Russia, and North Korea simultaneously. My question is, when China, Russia, and North Korea have coordinated the nuclear weapons? As a Chinese, I can hardly remember when China had a joint exercise with the North Korean military. So how can we coordinate our nuclear weapons? This is insane. This is totally insane. And for people to make a strategy based upon such insane analysis is crazy. Then let me talk about what I believe is China-US strategic stability. Strategic stability during the Cold War refers to the equilibrium in nuclear weapons. But I believe between China and the US, we can actually have a kind of strategic stability, not only on the number of nuclear warheads, but also including something new, that is cyber, AI, and outer space. I believe China and the US can afford to talk to each other in these three areas, just because the gap between the two have proposed in my article in Foreign Affairs. In cyber, we should exchange a list of sensitive targets between China and US that should not be attacked in any circumstances. And in AI, we should make sure that absolute human control over the command and control chain, especially over nuclear command and control system. And then in outer space, we should discuss about no placing nuclear weapons in outer space, as China and Russia have proposed, while at the same time, we can also discuss about what the West has proposed to talk about rule and responsible behaviors. Then let me come to the final part of what I'm going to say. Why I would consider no first use of nuclear weapons, a Chinese proposal is affordable for all nuclear weapon states. This is what I have published recently in Foreign Policy magazine, because I believe, first of all, there are two preconditions for us to talk about nuclear disarmament. First, it is impossible to ban nuclear weapons anytime soon. I know there is a treaty about prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2017 by non-nuclear weapon states. But none of the nuclear weapon states would wish to ban nuclear weapons now. So it is impossible. Again, what is impossible is that the nuclear weapon states would wish to reduce the nuclear stockpiles amid ever-intensifying competition. as I have just said, probably China would also have to increase, reasonably its nuclear stockpile. So again, this is another impossibility. But I believe with this tool as preconditions, no first use looks like the most realistic approach in reducing nuclear threats. Why is that? Because the first reason is very simple. It would not reduce your capabilities for retaliation, even if you promise no first use. And you, at the same time, would enjoy moral high ground. So it would not harm your capability, and it would add to your clout. The other reason is, I believe, after some studies, that American, British, and French nuclear policies actually are not so far away from China's no first use. Let me come to each one of them. For example, Americans' recent nuclear policy has changed a bit, but until 2022, for example, in its nuclear posture review, it said that it would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interest of the United States or its allies and partners. What confused me is the keyword, vital interest. I just cannot imagine what kind of vital interest, American interest or interest of allies would require the United States to use nuclear weapons first. Didn't the United States already use nuclear weapons first? And what kind of interests are so important for the United States that have the strongest conventional forces and also one of the largest number of nuclear warheads? I know American allies are concerned. They want the United States to provide nuclear umbrella. But let me come back to the example which I mentioned just now. Let's talk about the DPRK then. DPRK would make threats from time to time, but how likely would it be for them to really launch a nuclear attack? Because any use of nuclear weapons would be suicidal given the radioactive dust that would be lingering over Korean Peninsula. So the right question is, in what kind of circumstances would the DPRK to decide to commit suicide? The answer is unless they believe they can no longer live. So they want to die with you, right? So if we just consider that is the rationale of the DPRK leadership, then we do not need to worry about it. They use nuclear weapon to attack someone first. Then the nuclear policies of UK is very much similar to that of the United States, because UK also talk about using nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances of self-defense. And when we come to France, France has pledged to adhere to a principle of strict sufficiency. So having said all this, this is what I have concluded, that the nuclear policies of these countries actually are not that far away from China's. The biggest challenge, of course, is how to get Russia in. Actually, I would say Russia's strategy to escalate, to de-escalate has actually worked in the war in Ukraine, because so far the United States has still put some limits on what Ukraine can do with the weapons that it supplies. So I believe Russian strategy has worked. So how can Russia, give it up to pledge no first use? But then there is a dilemma of this strategy, because this strategy to escalate, to de-escalate depends on threats and fear of threat by other people. The point is, if people, feel the threat, they might become afraid. But if you really use it then you cannot control the scale of the retaliation by its adversaries. A tit-of-tat risk becoming a full-blown nuclear war that nobody wants. And for Russia, it might just invite the involvement of NATO, the very thing that Moscow fears most if Russia really uses nuclear weapons. So this is what I suggest, a kind of a dual-track approach, my personal suggestion, how we can just do it. In Europe, I suggest 2 steps for NATO. The first step is that NATO can make a unilateral no first use pledge against Russia as a gesture of goodwill. Does NATO want to use nuclear weapons first against Russia? Never. So you can afford to make a unilateral no first use pledge, because with this gesture, tensions can start to soar. Then the second step is a little bit bitter for NATO to swallow, but still is affordable for NATO. That is, NATO can pledge to halt any further expansion of its allies in exchange for Moscow to adopt no first use policy. NATO would say, oh, why should I just stop expansion? Because other countries want to join. But my argument is that at least NATO's expansion has a role in Russia's response. If it is not the entire reason, but there is a reason, because Russian leaders keep talking about it. And then, from another realistic point of view, right now there are only 3 countries on the waiting list to join NATO. That is Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. All these 3 countries, have some troubled relationship with Russia, because they want to join NATO. And Georgia and Ukraine, one had a war, another is having a war. So even these 3 countries, the entry into NATO would bring more trouble rather than benefit. And there aren't many countries anyway. So I believe it is affordable. And then in Asia, China and Russia have already agreed to no first use against each other, apparently because of the good relationship. But if China and the United States could reach a similar agreement, then it would de-escalate a lot of potential conflicts involving American allies. So the crucial point is whether China and the United States could reach a similar agreement. So people might consider you're a bit too naive to believe that the United States will do that. But I don't think I'm naive if I just give you a lesson from history. India and Pakistan conducted nuclear tests in 1998. And very soon, China and the United States came to something which is so rare. That is, they quickly agreed to show solidarity between 2 nuclear powers. That is, to de-target their nuclear weapons at each other. And in 2 years' time, all the P5 countries have agreed on non-targeting in 2000. So the strong point of this agreement is that it is a good sign of the goodwill of the nuclear weapon states toward nuclear disarmament. It's not that significant, but at least it's symbolic, right? And the bad thing is, well, non-targeting, no matter how good it is not verifiable. How do you know if I'm targeting Russia or the United States or not, right? But I believe no first use is a natural step forward. Listen to this. Non-targeting of nuclear weapons at each other. What is the next step? Of course, no first use of nuclear weapons, right? And no first use of nuclear weapon is not lip service. Some people say China's promotion of no first use is a kind of diplomatic ploy. But then let me say, how about all of us join this diplomatic ploy? Because this would become morally binding. Because it is verifiable if you use nuclear weapons first. Non-targeting is not verifiable, but no first use, of course, is verifiable, right? And it's good for the world. Then finally, if all P5 countries have agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won, why can't we pledge no first use? So let me stop here. Yeah, thank you for your kind patience. And now let me try my best to answer some of your questions if you have any. Thank you. Give me, I can't hear you.
Hi, Bo. Yes, thanks very much for that. So Carol Turner, you have a question. If you want to unmute, you can ask the speaker your question.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
I'd like you to comment on a proposition which goes beyond the notion of nuclear war between with Russia over Ukraine. Now, first of all, thank you very much, and I agree very strongly that no first use is a sort of logical step forward. But although I don't have anything like the experience that you have, I do have, I'm in London in Britain, I do have a considerable doubt that the United States will be willing to go along with this step-by-step process for the following reason. It's already becoming clear in Europe, in my opinion, that public opinion is moving in one way in relation to Ukraine, i.e. more in favour of supporting negotiations to end the war, whilst European political leaders are moving in the opposite direction. Just to give one example, if I may, there was a European Parliament resolution recently which was passed, which called for, and I'm going to quote, support in every way possible for Ukraine's victory. That's a sort of horrible, blood-curdling cry for a continuation of the war, in my opinion. What it seems to me the problem is, at the same time.
Carol, I'm sorry to interrupt, but really we've only got time for very short questions. You're depriving other people of a chance to ask their questions by this very long disquisition. What is your precise question?
It was just, I'm really sorry about that. I was just getting to my question. It's difficult when people on the call are from different experiences and different locations. I'll move now to my question. So do you think that beyond this, that the United States has an interest in maintaining the war in Ukraine? And I think that would be for two reasons. One is to prevent a block between China, Europe and Russia, which would make it considerably stronger than the United States. That's in the longer term, of course. And also for that same end, to foster bad relations between Germany and Russia and to encourage bad relations between Russia and China. Sorry again for taking up a lot of time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Carol. I do understand that there are two kinds of people supporting or opposing your views. For example, like Paul Krugman, the columnist in New York Times, has actually said that supporting Ukraine would not cost much. Yeah, but there are other people arguing the other way around. I believe right now the United States really is struggling to find a solution because it is actually involved in two wars. Yeah, and they believe that China is a pacing threat, so they want to be focused on China. So these two wars would definitely distract their attention. So I believe I don't think they want the war to continue. But as I said before, nobody knows how to end this war.
Okay, thank you very much. So Sergei Batsanov, would you like to unmute and ask a question? Thanks, Carol. Sergei, are you there? Would you like to ask your question? I see your hands raised. Yes, thanks.
Can you hear me, please?
We can hear you.
Thank you. First of all, it's an extremely interesting debate which has just started. I'm a rather long-time enthusiast of a non-first use objective. I understand that there are many difficulties on the way to this idea starting to get a strong traction. Small comment. Obama tried to change the US policy on this particular aspect just before, well, in the several last months before his departure from the White House. He failed. The common story is that he failed because the US allies objected to that. Now, my analysis was, even before that happened, that it was the US military who arranged for the rejection of this Obama's ideas by the closest, or some of the closest allies. My question is, well, maybe comment still. I think that we need to take into account a variety of factors, including new factors, in order to prepare a solid or a more reliable base for making progress on non-first use, including what you mentioned when you discussed important elements of strategic stability or achieving strategic stability between China and the US, artificial intelligence, space, and so on. I would very strongly note that the new functions, new capabilities of modern non-nuclear forces is becoming a stronger and stronger factor that needs to be addressed. Look at AUKUS, which mostly is intended against China.
Okay, can you come to your question,
Russia?
Please?
Yes, I understand, Peter. Now, one thing I need to correct. The debate in Russia about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine is a wrong description. Nobody is talking about Ukraine, basically, except for some idiots. Also high-level idiots. The question is about how to deter direct NATO involvement. That's in the center. To sum everything up, I think we need to move forward with the non-first use. The ideas are good. And we need to start discussing seriously those ideas, how they work. Starting with a track 2 process. Because track 1, unfortunately, at this point, has important limitations. I am not saying it's impossible, but it has important limitations. And there is a need to clarify interests, preoccupations, objectives, what stands, obstacles, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Well, apparently this is a very good but somewhat long comment. So because there is no question, I would just leave it to other people. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got two questions from Timothy Wright, which I'll try and read through quickly. So he asks, would a proposed no first use treaty also encompass changes to signatories' respective force postures? If countries continue to have a launch on warning posture, for instance, nuclear war can still happen through miscalculation or accident.
Sorry, Tim, your voice is interrupted.
Oh, okay.
Say again, please.
I'll start again. So he's asking, does an NFU, no first use treaty, encompasses change to a signatories' respective force postures? So for example, if countries continue to have a launch on warning posture, for instance, nuclear war can still happen through miscalculation or accident. So he's asking if you think that a political statement is sufficient. And secondly, China says it won't enter a nuclear arms race, but it's expanding the number of deployed platforms and delivery vehicles. So he's arguing that all the signs are that China will continue to expand its capacities, and how does this align with Beijing's position?
Okay, good. Let me come to the second question first. Well, I think China's increase of nuclear weapons, if it really happens, would not be on a huge margin. Therefore, it would not be considered a nuclear arms race. Yeah. So having more nuclear weapons, this is what I said, also, means that China needs to modernize its nuclear armed forces, because China would like to modernize all its military services, and its rocket force is just one of them. But then let me come to the first question. Yeah. So if all countries promise no first use, actually you put yourself in the hands of the people around the world. People will see if you really can honor your promise or not, right? If all nuclear weapons states just to say, okay, I want to be the first to use, then this is a consensus. And that would be encouraging for non-nuclear weapon states, because just think of this. Why should we just use nuclear weapon first, especially for the United States, which is the strongest nation on earth? If it's just like alliance, if the alliance is among a group of small, poor countries, I understand it, right? But if this kind of alliance is among the strongest nation on earth, then I do not understand it. So if you are the strongest nation, people know the consequence if they attack you. And you certainly have more than enough capability in retaliations. So why just you can't promise it? Because it would not reduce your capabilities in retaliation. This is what I say. And I know how difficult it is actually now for countries to adopt this no first use. But I believe once political conditions are, there could be a moment when political conditions are ripe. Because, when we talk about non-targeting of nuclear weapons, yeah, in before the 2000, there was also a voice in the United States who said, how can this be realistic? Yeah, what I'm thinking about you is about your capability. It's not about your gesture. But then this Indo-Pakistan nuclear test provides such a chance that the nuclear powers have to show a kind of solidarity. And the nuclear powers have to show the opposition, because the opposition is in line with NPT.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a few more questions, so I might ask you to indulge us by staying for a few more minutes, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions together. So one from Angela Vincent asks, what would happen if a terrorist organization developed a nuclear weapon and threatened any of the world powers? How would no first use policy work then? And David Cullen asks, to bring about a no first use policy, what assurances do you think China could or should give to US allies in East Asia about its intentions?
About terrorists, yeah. First of all, do they have nuclear weapons, or would they use nuclear weapon first? Yeah, but because if they use nuclear weapon first, if you retaliate, you are fully entitled to retaliate, right? So the genuine question actually is, how could you retaliate, with nuclear weapons against a group of terrorists who could easily hide themselves somewhere. It's difficult to detect. The second question, say again, what is the second question?
The second question, which a couple of people are asking, is to advance a no first use position globally, what assurances do you think that China could or should give to US allies in East Asia about its intentions? Because some people worry if they don't have extended deterrence from the US, it might embolden China or others to engage in military aggression using conventional capabilities.
Right. Actually, I've already answered this question. Let's talk about East Asia. Okay, let's talk about China. Why, in any circumstances, would China launch a nuclear attack on any countries? China, claim large part of South China Sea, but so far China has made no threats at all toward any country in Southeast Asia, and China is even negotiating a code of conduct with Southeast Asia. And why would China want to use nuclear weapons against Japan? You just can hardly give me an example to say China has intention to use nuclear weapon against any country in East Asia. So the only example I gave just now is about DPRK, in which I argue, even if DPRK would make threats from time to time, with crazy remarks, but in reality, any launch of nuclear, weapons, even small nuclear bombs, is suicidal because the Korean Peninsula is too small. So they, in spite of the rhetorics, can hardly make this decision unless they want to commit suicide with someone. The only question, as I said, is why would they want to commit suicide? And in what circumstances they want to commit suicide? The answer is unless they believe they could no longer live, so they want to die with you.
Okay, thank you. I hope that's answered people's questions. I have got a couple of hand raised, so if you don't mind, I'll ask people to ask their other questions. So I've got Agustin and then Reese. So Agustin, do you want to unmute and then ask your question first?
Thank you. Many times the West assume that you can totally control the People's Republic of North Korea and all those issues, that you are in continuous and very close touch with them. And then I suppose that this extends to discussions on nuclear weapons and things like that. I mean, can I have a general comment about it? So how is the relations between you and North Korea in this situation? Thank you.
Yeah. You see, there are so many debates about whether North Korean leadership is rational or not. But if you look at what happened in the last 20 years, I think it is correct to say they have worked so fine on brinksmanship, right? And the brinksmanship requires a lot of calculation, a lot of rationality, a lot of reason. It's not something easily to be done. It's walking on a tightrope. So I would assume, the leadership of DPRK is rational.
Okay, thank you. Reese, do you want to go next?
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering about non-strategic nuclear weapons in this context and how it's almost ignore a no first use declaration, even if this was agreed. So I suppose I'm worried with whether this is just an idea at risk management, though I think it's admirable or otherwise positive. I'm concerned, I suppose, in a conflict over Taiwan, where the conflict pressure would exceed this threshold anyway, and we could still have nuclear use as we've discussed, and should specifically be in the context of non-strategic nuclear weapons.
Well, at least in China, there are some intermediate range missiles that are nuclear capable. That is true. But still, China has promised not to use nuclear weapons against anyone. So why should we use it against our own people? So I think this would be the last thing we can possibly see from mainland China. It's we describe Taiwanese people as our own compatriots. So how can you imagine that we would use nuclear weapons? So it's totally unimaginable. I don't believe there is such a scenario. But what is dangerous is what I said, just now about some American people, even Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and some think tanks openly ask for United States to use nuclear weapons in Taiwan Strait. Yeah, you can just Google that very easily. And historically, they talked about using nuclear weapons against China. So then I have to compare about this. When the West talked about, Russia, they're just afraid Russia would use nuclear weapons. But when they talk about China, it seems that they're not afraid of China's smaller nuclear arsenals. Instead, they talk about using them first against the Chinese. So the simple logic for Chinese, of course, is that we have to increase our nuclear arsenal. And for us, as I mentioned before, it's just a political decision, right? We are economically strong. We have technical know-how. We're the strongest industrial nation on earth. So I would say that the Western countries should really congratulate themselves for China being so patient until now.
Thank you. We've got 3 more questions and I think we'll wrap it up. And I'll call Peter back. So Robin asks, let's assume we did agree a global no first use policy or even one that was bilateral between the US and China, what do you see as the next step to build on that after no first use policy has been agreed by all nuclear weapon states? And secondly, Tatsujiro asks, what about negative security assurances for non-nuclear weapon states? How does that play into this?
Well, actually, I haven't, thought much about what might go beyond the no first use, because in spite of my proposal, I believe this is really the light at the end of the tunnel. It's dim light. It's not bright light. It's difficult for us to do it, although I believe it is the right thing to do, and it is affordable for all nuclear weapon states. And then I believe we have to discuss about the ways forward, because in NPT, the total nuclear disarmament is a goal of mankind. Let me give you another example. I just briefly mentioned about our competition in outer space, right? China and Russia said no placement of any weapons in outer space. I think this makes a lot of sense. Don't we already have enough weapons on Earth? Why should you place weapons in orbit? And which human folly is more monumental than placing something in outer space to strike back on Earth, our own planet, our own homeland? But the United States and the Western countries just believe, okay, it's impossible to not place any weapon in orbit. Therefore, we can deploy them, but we need to discuss about responsible behavior. But I believe it is possible, because even no Western countries would describe what they have deployed in space as a weapon. So we should prevent that from happening. So this would be totally much more relaxed if ordinary people think, okay, we do not have any weapons anywhere in outer space. Because China and Russia's proposal comes from the Moon Treaty, which is a step forward from Moon Treaty, which prohibits any placement of weapons in Moon. If you don't place any weapon in Moon, why would you place any weapon anywhere in orbit, right? If it is not for Americans' desire for absolute supremacy, what is impeding Americans from doing so?
Great, thank you. And lastly, Ian, do you want to ask a question? And then I'll hand over back to Peter for closing remarks.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. Thank you very much for a very good talk so far. It strikes me that what worries China's neighbors is not so much its nuclear weapons, but its huge economic power, its massive army, and it's what I would say is a kind of expansionist attitude in wanting to take over the South China Sea, for example. And it's that really, I think, that prevents maybe the US from declaring a no first use policy, because it wants to preserve the right to prevent or deter China, say, from expanding into and taking over the US's allies. How do you feel about that?
Okay. First, I think it's really a good thing for Chinese economy to be booming for any Chinese like me. And for China, China's military is really growing with strength. That is no doubt. But if you talk about China's South China Sea, China is not, impeding with any ships of, freedom navigation in the South China Sea. There are 100,000 ships transiting South China Sea. Have you ever heard any complaint from this ship that China is impeding in freedom of navigation? Yes, China has some territorial disputes with some ASEAN countries, but people always forget one thing. These claimants have overlapping claims themselves. It's not only between China and ASEAN countries. The problem is that China looks much, much bigger than these countries. So that is why people always talk about dispute between China and these small countries. That is a human instinct. People love something small. Baby cucumber, baby tomato. So small is lovely if big is beautiful. That is the only reason I can give.
Thank you so much for that answer, and to everyone for your questions and for the patience and detail which you've answered the questions. So I'll hand back over to Peter.
Thank you, Tim, for managing that. I'm just going to abuse my position to slip in a very short question myself. Bo, I'm puzzled. I'm very ready to believe that the purpose of the modernization is to enhance China's deterrence capabilities. But it's a puzzle that this modernization is taking primarily the form of creating a large silo-based ICBM force, because silo-based ICBM forces are actually relatively vulnerable to a counterforce first strike by an adversary. So they are not the most obvious way of strengthening and enhancing one's deterrence capability. You probably can't comment on my question, but if you can, I'd be interested.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for a good question. You're right. I'm not in a position to comment on it because in China, we do not, confirm about foreigners' assessment of China's nuclear capabilities. And we ourselves do not talk about number of nuclear warheads, so on and so forth. So I'm really not in a position to comment on that. Sorry.
That's all right. I was anticipating, and forgive me asking it, but I am genuinely puzzled. So if one day I can find an answer, I shall be very pleased. It's been a wonderful session. You're extremely well informed, but you've also, I sense at least, been very open with us, and your analysis is always first class, and you have a masterly grasp of your subject. So we couldn't really have asked for anything more or anything better. Thank you. Then the last thing I want to do is to say to any of you who are not Pugwash members, if you found this session interesting, please consider joining British Pugwash. It's easy to do. You'll find the necessary information on the British Pugwash site, together with a link to Tim Street, the secretary. And I think I feel that it's fair to say that Pugwash's mission and what Pugwash is trying to achieve is once more as important now as it was during the Cold War. So this is a good cause. Please join us. Thank you all anyway for taking part today. Goodbye.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.